والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى ويغفر لنا قصورنا وذنوبنا وأنت أرحم الراحمين فنتوجه إليك ونعتمد عليك ونعوذ بك ونستغفرك ونتوب إليك على الدوام والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Amma ba'd. So here we enter into a very uh, important topic, and that is, I think I have to correct the title as Bab al-Thalith, al-Bab al-Thalith, the third gateway. And in this series, we're covering the book Miratul Tullab, or the Mirror of the Student. The Mirror of the Student by Sheikh Uthman Danfodi, rahmatullahi alayhi, rahmatan wasi'ah. One of the things that we confront in this chapter, or the third gateway or entry to knowledge, is that Sheikh Uthman Danfodi, rahmatullahi alayhi, he does two things. One is what's visible in the text itself, and that is إرادة الأدلة النقلية المتعلقة بأصول الدين. He presents evidences which are rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah, which clarify for us what are considered to be principles in the foundations of the deen with regard to belief. The other thing that he does is that methodologically he's teaching us how to present to people a grounding, a rootedness in the knowledge of Islam, and specifically in the knowledge that pertains to what some today call Aqidah. This is the last chapter, and then we get into Al Bab al Rabi', and there he begins to talk about fiqh. He begins to talk about acts of worship, and these acts have a series of rulings, and they are various types. You can find the act of salah, you can find the preparation for the salah, those acts which have to be undertaken in order for a person to engage in salah, the prayer itself. Then you have the act of fasting and everything that's associated with that, and different types of fasting that gives us a more specific understanding of fasting. And then you have uh, zakah, which is the right of the poor with regard to our wealth. Then you have hajj, and you keep going from there, which hajj is the pilgrimage. Then you have the whole issue of uh, other types of actions that pertain to the practice of the Muslims, and to the more wider definition of worship. Worship is not just confined to the four pillars of Islam outside of belief, but worship also entails how we engage in business transactions, how we engage in marital transactions, so on and so forth. That's extremely important. But here we're dealing with chapter 3, and what he's doing now in الباب الثالث في علم أصول الدين is that he's laying down for us a foundation as to what it is that people should believe fundamentally. And here, he lays down what is common ground, in other words. And he methodologically is teaching us what we should introduce to the people. He's not introducing detail and controversy. This is one of the issues that has created problems. Now, when we look at the definition of usul al-din, and we look at the fact that Sheikh Uthman Danfodi separated usul al-din from ilm al-kalam, ilm usul al-din from ilm usul, from ilm al-kalam. So one of the things that is essential is that he states in the beginning, he says, let me read it from the Arabic first. He says, Rahmatullahi alayhi wa yanfa'ana Allah bi'ilmihi fi ad-darain. Amin. He says, وأقول بالله التوفيق إن الله تعالى أثبت جميع أصول الدين في القرآن العظيم إلهياتها ونبوياتها وسمياتها. So those things which pertain to who Allah is, the divinity of Allah, those things which pertain to what we understand of prophethood, and those things which pertain to knowledge of the unseen, these three areas of knowledge which constitute the foundations of the deen. Here, Sheikh Uthman al-Fodi is saying that they're established in the Quran. And then he gives a number of different examples also of support for those same realities found in the Quran with regard to the foundations of belief. He also notes that they're found in the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, more specifically in the Ahadith. He says something that is distinct to the Ash'ari position. He says, أحاديث علم وأصول الدين متواترة وإنما اقتصرنا على إيراد بعضها اختصارا وأما حده كما قال علماء السنة رضي الله عنهم فهو علم يبحث فيه عما يجب اتقاده مما يجب لله ويستهيل عليه وما يجوز له وما يجب لرسله وما يستهيل عليه وما يجوز لهم وأمور البرزخ والقيام على قانون الإسلام. وأما الفرق بينه وبين علم الكلام فهو أنه عاني علم أصول الدين إذا اقترن به نسب الأدلة العقلية مع حكاية أقوال أهل البدع والفلسفة فهو علم الكلام، وإلا فأصول الدين هذا هو الفرق بينهما. ومنهم من يسمى أصول الدين علم الكلام لأن أول مسألة وقعت فيه مسألة الكلام، ثم اعلم أن كل ما لا يجب معرفته في العقيدة لا يسمى أصول الدين بل هو أيضا من علم الكلام، وقد أطبق السلف والخلف على وجوب تعلم أصول الدين مع كل مكلف، وأما علم الكلام فهو من فروض الكفايات. Here, Sheikh Ahmad al-Fawdi, he states something very important. And I read the whole thing so I can just reflect upon it. First, he says that the uh, realities of belief was foundational, are found in the Quran and in the Sunnah. But here he says that what's foundational for belief, it should be based on evidences which are clear, evidences which are of the highest order of authenticity, and provide some certainty. That's the indirect statement that he's making. Because he says, Ahadithu ilm al-kalam, I'm sorry, Ahadith ilm usul al-din mutawatira. And that's a common position. That's a common position that, that the Ahadith utilized in establishing the foundations of belief are Ahadith that should be of the highest levels of authenticity. The discussion about utilizing Ahadith that don't meet the criteria of what we call the mutawatir narration. And the mutawatir narration is a narration which has been related by so many people by different chains of transmissions that they can't be accused or proved to have colluded. There's no collusion in generating that statement. So, in other words, it's so widespread by so many different means of transmission that it stands as truth. It's not a matter of fabrication. It's not a matter of people contriving, conniving, colluding to pass on information. And that's important because, firstly, the foundational knowledge base for Aqidah, he's putting it to be the Quran, and then he's saying these ahadith. The issue of the usage of other hadith that don't meet the criteria of the mutawatir, I'm not going to get into that today. That has a discussion in and of itself, and that's a matter of difference of opinion. The people of hadith take a position on that, and they vary among themselves, but a strong position is that those are hadith that are sound are also utilized in discussing issues of belief. But here he's just laying down what's common ground, what we can all agree with across the different groups. Now, where there's a difference of opinion is on this issue of can we use other ahadith in discussing what's foundational belief. But in any event, he just is giving us what's clear, what's basic and what's clear, and where there's no debate. One of the things that he says is that usul al-din, or the foundations of belief in this case, of deen. Deen here, when he's talking about foundations of the deen, he's not talking about the whole of Islam. He's talking about creed, what it is that we believe. So he says that the definition of usul al-din is that knowledge in which we come to know by way of research what's obligatory for us to believe in relation to God, to Allah, and what is not possible for God. In other words, what are qualities which are not qualities that God would have, and what it is that we believe with regard to the prophets, and what it is that we don't believe with regard to the prophets, what's not possible for prophets to have as qualities if they're going to be considered prophets. And then the issue of knowledge of the unseen, like the intermediate state, the barzakh, and the day of judgment or the qiyamah, according to how it is that Islam understands these things. So usul al-din is just foundational knowledge. Now he separates, and he's not the first one to do that. You know, this is coming back in the tradition of the scholars. You find that in Imam al-Adud in the Muwaqif of al-Iji, he separates as well to a certain extent between the foundations of the deen and ilm al-kalam, and he gives a definition of what ilm al-kalam is, or what it is that we would call a theoretical philosophical approach to Aqidah. And this is what Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio is doing. He's saying that there is a separation between the two. Although some have used the words or the terms, better said, usul al-din and ilm al-kalam interchangeably, in essence, there's a separation between the two in quality. Why? Because ilm al-kalam, it takes the knowledge of the foundations of the deen and it adds to that knowledge rational or philosophical proofs for why we believe what we believe in, and then it also adds to the pot, so to speak, statements that are made by groups that would be considered deviant groups, and it refutes those positions that they have to establish rationally by way of argumentation that's supposed to be persuasive, that's supposed to remove doubt, what it is that Muslims believe. And that's not obligatory. That type of knowledge is not obligatory for us to know and for the general community to know. And he mentions that ilm al-kalam فهو من فروض الكفايات is something to be known by some people that are specialized in that area of knowledge. It's not an obligation for all of us to know on the individual level. But what's obligatory for us to know is what is called ilm usul al-din, was foundational knowledge in the deen. And Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi, he says that this knowledge, the basis of it, can be found in the Quran and in the Sunnah. People may differ with the orientation he takes, because he does have uh, an Ashari inclination, but he's very clear to separate between what's foundational knowledge and what is considered detailed knowledge, or what's considered to be knowledge which is not obligatory for a Muslim to know with regard to belief. And I want to say this today, and I want to go into this. I want to create another live session for this, but today I want to just close out with this point. one of the things that Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi does as a master educator is that he puts things in their proper place. So, in laying down the foundation, he's introducing to the people what's essential for them to know. And in this gateway, this chapter, he's quoting directly from the Quran and the Sunnah on what's foundational. And then, as promised by him, he's relating what the scholars of Islam have said as well. And so, one of the most important things that he does here is that he says, Ilm al Kalam is from al Furud al Kifayat. Says, Ilm al Kalam is not an obligation on the people. And we know that the idea of Ilm al Kalam is not agreed upon by the scholars, whether we should enter that type of knowledge or not. And some will say, well, that's a Salafi idea and so on and so forth. And that's not the case at all. The scholars of Hadith among themselves, you find Ibn Salah and others, many scholars that had nothing to do with Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, that had nothing to do with Ibn Taymiyyah and so on and so forth. And they were against this type of approach, is even attributed to Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik as well. This has nothing to do with the Salafi da'wah at all. This has to do with the historical reality. Now, ironically, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah is a muhaddith mutakallim. Some may not like that definition, but if you go by the definition of what ilm al-kalam is, which is to have the capacity to speak, right? More specifically, to have the ability to establish proofs to justify and support and remove certainty from Islamic belief and to persuade others so that they're not able to refute with evidences, right, that which they may have doubt in regarding the belief. That's my uh, translation to try to bring close to mind what it is that ilm al-kalam is supposed to be doing. Well, you find that Ibn Taymiyyah does the same thing, but he has his own approach. You know, if you want to talk about the approach of Imam Ahmed or Imam Malik or some of the older Imams in Aqidah that were just relating Hadith and Aqidah, and they minimally engage in rational discussions on what Aqidah is all about. And so, in any event, the basics or foundational teachings with regard to Aqidah, meaning belief or creed, is clear cut. It's clear cut. And so the things that uh, he brings up, who is Allah, right? And so he brings up who is Allah and what are things that should be known about Allah. That Allah has established the creation of the universe, right? And with this, he quotes the Quran directly, right? He quotes the Quran directly. He says, "Huwa alladhi yabda'u al-khalq thumma yu'iduh." Right? خالق كل شيء. And أفي الله شك فاتر السماوات والأرض. So you see that he's quoting ayat of the Quran. ذلك بأن الله هو الحق. Right? وتوكل على الحي الذي لا يموت. These ayat of the Quran that he's quoting are to establish certain qualities of Allah. So he's quoting the ayat of the Quran with regard to the fact that Allah has created the universe, and He is the one who begins the creation, then renews it. With regard to Allah wa Ta'ala not being limited with life or basically alive, right? Is there doubt with regard that He is the originator of the heavens and the earth? The translation is not the translation is not all that great in that regard. Let me see. So we depend upon وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ, right? وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى الْحَيِّ, I'm sorry, الَّذِي لَا يَمُوتُ. Depend on Allah, on the living, the one that doesn't die, right? And so that's to prove that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, I'm sorry because I'm a little tired this morning. That's to prove that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has life, has the quality of life, right? So let me read the translation all the way through so that it can flow because it's not 100% lined up as I thought it was. This is because Allah has established the creation of the universe by His words. And He is the one who begins creation and then renews it. And by His words, He is the creator of everything. He, the Exalted, has established the fact that His existence is absolutely necessary. By His words, is there doubt regarding Allah, that He is the originator of the heavens and the earth? And by His words, or have they been created by nothing? And by His words, that is because Allah, He is the real. He, the Exalted, has established the fact that His existence is before times by His words. He is the first. He, the Exalted, has established the fact that His existence is continuous after time by His words, and rely upon the living who will never die. He, the Exalted, has established the fact that His existence is unlike His creation by His words. There's nothing like Him. He, the Exalted, has established the fact that His existence is independent of the creation, in other words, by His words, and Allah is the rich beyond dependence. He is the Exalted. He, the Exalted, has established the fact that His existence is one alone by His words. Say, He is Allah, one alone. So what He's doing is He's quoting the Quran to establish certain qualities that Allah has in a systematic way, and so that we are clear that these qualities are essentials to who Allah is. I'm going to stop here, and then in the next session I'll be more focused on these things, on the qualities of Allah, on the qualities of the Prophet, on issues of the unseen. Right here, they translate it as the hereafter, but in reality, is semiyat, is issues that are unseen because the knowledge of it comes to us by hearing, by what's transferred to us by the prophet as far as knowledge is concerned with regard to what happens in the hereafter and with regard to what goes on in the unseen, like the existence of angels and so on and so forth. That's a matter of the unseen. The existence of heaven and the existence of heaven and hell. It's a matter of the unseen. And so we have to come back to that point. But today's session, I wanted to just focus on the fact that Sheikh Uthman al Fodi is separating between usul al-din, ilm usul al-din, and ilm usul al-kalam. He's not the only one to do that, but he's making sure that you're clear on it. Because sometimes what happens, people, with regard to Aqidah, is some of the scholars, they just run with the idea that ilm al-kalam and ilm usul al-din are the same thing because they use the terms overlapping. But in content, they're not the same thing. In content, the foundational creed is not presented to the community with doubt and argumentation and refutation of points that are erroneous. What's foundational in the creed is made very clear And then the idea of having to deal with doubts and the idea of having to prove things philosophically, that's an issue that is from the furu', is not from the usul. That's why he establishes the difference between usul al-din and ilm al-kalam. And for those that may have a refutation on this point, I want to say that Imam al-Adad fi al-Muwaqif, he says al-kalam علم يقتدر معه على إثبات العقائد الدينية بإيراد الحجج ودفع الشبه والمراد بالعقائد ما يقصد به نفس العقائد دون العمل. So he's basically saying that here the focus is not our actions in Aqidah. The focus is on what we believe. Now, Ilm al Kalam is dealing with the issue of establishing the foundations of Aqidah and other beliefs that are not foundational by bringing rational proofs in a systematic manner with rational principles. And the objective is supposed to be to remove doubt. But when you look further, the reality of that is that it's not only uh, that you're just bringing rational proofs and so on and so forth. Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodi himself, he says towards the end of this section, he says, Usul al-Din, it is a science which researches into that which is obligatory to believe with regard to what is necessary to understand regarding Allah and what's impossible to attribute to Allah and what's conceivable to understand with regard to Allah. It searches into what is necessary for us to know with regard to the messengers and what's impossible for them to have its qualities. It also searches into matters that deal with the barzakh, the intermediate state, and the day of judgment based upon the principles of Islam. As for the distinction between this science, usul al-din, meaning the science of the foundations of the deen, and ilm al-kalam, or the scholastic theology, this is noted in that ilm usul al-din is an obligation firstly, and ilm al-kalam is a collective responsibility on the community, is not an obligation on the individuals. Ilm al-kalam is focused on providing rational proofs along with mentioning the evidences and positions of people that are considered to be innovators or the people of bid'ah and philosophers as well. So that's the distinction, that usul al-din is not getting involved in that intricacy. And see, that's where we have created a lot of damage, in that both in today's time, both within the Salafi da'wah and within the Ashari circles in today's time, there has been a push to go into details and argumentation on points of Aqidah. And part of that has been because of the way that we studied. So there became a widespread focus on details of Aqidah, and what's clear in Aqidah was somewhat confused because people, they didn't know how to deal with certain issues. And so Uthman Danfodio is not taking us into that realm right now. He's making sure that we have an understanding that there is a basis of belief that's just universal, that we all believe it, that we, as across the different groups, there's a common ground on what belief is. There may be some differences with regard to how it's presented, but at the core of what usul al-din, nobody's differing on that. The differences come when we start talking about just some details and understanding certain issues. And so that needed to be explained to the people, that there's a difference between what's clear and foundational, and there between that and where there is a variety of opinions on how we understand things. And then there's some things that fall within the ballpark, and then there's some things which are outside of the ballpark with regard to understanding those detailed issues. In other words, we should be systematic in every step that we're taking so that people can have a foundation for where it is that they're walking. So they should know the difference between what's essential and what's not essential. And that's part of the dilemma. That's part of the dilemma, that people want to say usul and furu', but in reality, they have dragged the community into furu', and they don't want to establish a common ground because it's a war zone in terms of Aqidah teaching. And that's not good. It's not good, because what happens with that is that people don't know how to separate between what conversations they should be in and what conversations they shouldn't be in, because they're not qualified to be in those conversations. And so this is the dilemma that we get into. And if they're going to jump into those detailed issues according to a particular school of thought, they should limit themselves and just say that we believe like this, and that's it. There's no necessity for refutation. There's no necessity for a person that's non initiated into the principles of scholarship and that is known to be a leader in the community as a scholar to engage in refutation. And then the one that has the qualifications as a scholar should determine if they're talking on these issues is going to create more damage. And it should always be done with high character and without disparaging people and without causing, as you know, with the intent of not causing damage as much as possible in our community. But in any event, I went beyond the time that I wanted to focus on. Uh, we'll come back to this issue. This Wednesday, we were supposed to have a class. We won't have it this Wednesday. We'll transfer it to Thursday morning. I'll make a note of that. We'll transfer this class to Thursday morning. This class is supposed to meet Mondays and Wednesdays at 7:30. We're covering the mirror of the students. Some of the translation I shifted myself to make it flow in a different way. Uh, but we'll regroup. What we're going to do is we're going to take this section in some detail, and we're going to summarize it again because it is an important section before we go into fiqh. And also, we're going to review chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3 all together before we go into chapter 4 to get a little more focus with it. This is a text which doesn't have a lot of explanation, people. There is no circulated explanation for this text. So it requires uh, sitting with it, it requires reflecting on it, and it requires research. And so I ask you to forgive me for my deficiencies in this presentation. And hopefully, we'll get it together and we'll be able to take the benefit from it. It is an amazing text, I'll be honest with you, and the way that it is that he deals with issues. Uh, Sheikh Uthman Danfodio is an amazing scholar in that way. He's not just presenting information, he's building a community. And so there's a certain type of style that he utilizes to present information. And one of those things that he does is that he is like a doctor in that he gives the amount of information that's necessary for one to establish a foundation to be able to move to the next level. He doesn't mix levels. The other thing that he does is that he crosses some lines and what's understood by traditional approaches, a popular traditional approach. And so he's introduced the Quran and Sunnah at a very early period, where a lot of scholars, how they were writing, is that they were writing really with a minimal amount of Quran and Sunnah in their books, just to simplify and clarify. But Sheikh Uthman Danfodi, he doesn't do that in this book, because this text is meant for you to know the Quran and the Sunnah, especially as it pertains to various topics, 50 topics, which he considers to be the 50 topics that are foundational in the knowledge of the Deen. And so that's how we are going to proceed. We're going to review this chapter thoroughly. Then we're going to regroup. We're going to review one, chapter two, chapter three, before we go into the fiqh, so that we solidify our knowledge, inshallah. And I appreciate those who are accompanying me on the journey. Make dua for me. May Allah forgive us all. And may Allah increase us in knowledge. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.